Okay, this is Aaron Crawford. This is January 5th, 2015. Talking with Jeffrey Toobin for the Collective Memory Project. To begin with, can you just give us a little bit of your background and how you came to cover the matters of judicial nominations for the New Yorker?
Sure. Hi. I am currently a staff writer for the New Yorker. I'm the senior legal analyst on CNN. I cover legal affairs for both. I'm a lawyer myself. I spent several years as a prosecutor. I wrote a book about being the junior member of the team that prosecuted Oliver North. I then went to work at the New Yorker in 1993. In 2007, I wrote The Nine, Inside the Secret, I'm going to give myself a plug, Inside the Secret World of the Supreme Court, which is really an account of the Supreme Court from the early mid-90s through the appointments of Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito. I covered the confirmations of them, and I wrote several articles for The New Yorker about judicial nominations and politics during the Bush administration, and covered it to a certain extent on CNN as well.
Okay. Well, to kind of begin with, what are your impressions of the judicial nomination process in the Clinton administration, particularly in the final years? It may be sort of how that process had changed since the 80s.
Well, I think as a general rule that judicial politics are politics, that the idea that the judiciary, especially the nomination and confirmation process, is somehow separate or really much different from other legislative and political matters is just a false idea. And that idea really underlines the way I've covered this issue from the beginning. So with that as a backdrop, I would say that there was a period of relative calm during especially the first term of President Bill Clinton. It's really hard to believe, but Ruth Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer were both confirmed with more than 90 votes. I mean, here you have a woman who was a very active member of the American Civil Liberties Union, which today might be a disqualification from even being nominated, much less confirmed, much less with more than 90 votes. There was that calm period. But as the Republican Party moved to the right, the Gingrich Revolution in '94, the growing politicization of basically everything, the process became more and more bogged down in politics. And I would say the Republican Party got more interested in judicial nominations, so that even though there were no Supreme Court vacancies during the rest of President Clinton's term, the process became more contentious. And when President Bush was elected, there was a lot of pent-up energy to get their nominees on the courts.
Well, transitioning to Bush, and you have written extensively about the 2000 election and the after election. Where would you place the issue of the judiciary and judicial nominations in the campaign?
Well, during the campaign, modest to non-existent. I mean, one of my pet peeves is that the judiciary does not play as significant a role as it should in in our presidential campaigns, given how important that issue is. Customarily, I think you could test this. There has been one question in every debate in every debate cycle, not every debate, one question about the importance of Supreme Court nominees, and that was certainly true in Bush Gore in 2000, Bush Kerry in 2004, that the Democrat says if the Republican wins, Roe v. Wade's going to be overturned. The Republican doesn't quite say that, but leaves that impression. But then the issue is left. I think the unusual way that Bush took office, in light of a very controversial Supreme Court decision, brought the issue more to the fore than the campaign did. So I think people were very much aware of the importance of the courts heading into President Bush's first term, 2001.
And that's sort of something that we've heard through some of these interviews. In fact, we've heard the name of Ted Cruz in the 2000 election. People who were really interested in the issue. It wasn't a campaign issue, but it seems to be the decision, and sort of certain people in the campaign sort of gave the administration this really kind of solid idea of what they wanted the court to be. And of course, Bush's first slate of nominees were all at once.
Well, and you know, just I mean, it's worth pausing. I mean, there are a couple of issues there. One is there is a community of people, mostly in Washington, but not exclusively in Washington, who care deeply about these issues, who are very involved in these issues, who know constitutional law, who know all the players, they know the prospective nominees. There is a conversation going on in Washington all the time about these issues. It's among a fairly small group of people, but it's very detailed and very knowledgeable, but it really doesn't include the public very much. I don't mean to suggest there's anything untoward about that. I mean, the public just doesn't care that much, so it's not like they're conducting this all in secret, but you know, in secret in some sinister way. But you have a group of people who are talking about a farm team of nominees, particularly to the circuit courts and the Supreme Court, all the time. And you know, there are not really formal lists, but there are conversations that go on all the time among people on both sides. And certainly, you know, former Supreme Court clerks are a big part of that. People who work in the Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel, Solicitor General's office, people who work in the appellate practices of you know, the handful of firms that do this really well. Tom Goldstein, who runs SCOTUS blog, really knows the players on both sides very well. Kirkland and Ellis, and the firms tend to separate themselves out. Democratic firms and Republican firms. You know, Wilmer Hale is Democrats, Kirkland and Ellis is Republicans. You know, people like Chris Landau, former Thomas clerk, who helps pick the clerks for Thomas, very important player on the Republican side. Walter Dellinger, who was at O'Melveny and Myers, former acting Solicitor General under Clinton, very active on the Democratic side. You know, these conversations go on all the time. I'm sorry, I'm rambling. What's the answer
You're on to, you're sort of leading to one of the questions that is really important, which is, and it came up in the first round of hearings of the Bush nominees, and that's the influence of the Federalist Society.
Right.
Can you explain a little bit about?
Well, you know, it's interesting. The Federalist Society is, Democrats talk about it like it's something out of the Da Vinci Code, like it's some sinister secret organization. There's nothing secret or sinister about it. But it is the wellspring of conservative thought, conservative individuals. I mean, it's a place for conservatives to gather and talk about these issues. Their meetings are open to the public. They often have debates with very prominent liberal lawyers. So it's not like it is purely a strategizing session for conservative legal ideas, but it's a network. It's a network of people who are roughly similar in their views. You have a split to a certain extent in the conservative movement that doesn't come up all that often between the more libertarian and the more authoritarian conservatives. But by and large, you can define what it means to be a legal conservative. And the Federalist Society is a way that these folks get to know each other and take their measure and learn whom they can promote for jobs.
You sort of get the impression, talking to several people, that this was the point where the society had been around long enough. There was a maturation that people, they were ready. They had plenty of people ready to go onto the bench, seeing that it was only formed in the early 80s at this point. So,
yeah, I think that's right. And also, I mean, who were the presidents during, Republican presidents during that period? Ronald Reagan in the very early days. It was a very significant period for very conservative judges. Edwin Meese, a very underrated figure in American history, I think, who really took these issues very seriously and brought along a lot of very conservative nominees, and you saw that. But the Republican Party wasn't yet the Republican Party of Ted Cruz in 1981, 2, 3. So you did have Antonin Scalia, you did have William Rehnquist promoted to Chief Justice, but you also had Sandra Day O'Connor, and you had, they did try to get Robert Bork, but they recognized, after Bork lost, that they had to go with someone like Anthony Kennedy. So, George Herbert Walker Bush, I think by all accounts, didn't care about these issues very much. I mean, it just wasn't of particular interest to him. So you had him essentially talked into David Souter in 1990, someone very few people had heard of. But John Sununu was the White House Chief of Staff from New Hampshire, Warren Rudman from New Hampshire, very important backers of his. But then the following year, you had Clarence Thomas, so who was very conservative. I mean, it just wasn't a big priority for George Herbert Walker Bush. I can't tell you how much George Walker Bush personally cared about these issues, but he was part of a movement that cared deeply about them. Vice President Cheney, very important in applying a seriously conservative screen to judicial nominees. I mean, things had changed. So yes, I think the maturation of the Federalist Society was important in sort of setting the stage for what George Walker Bush did with the courts, but it was a symptom, it wasn't a cause of the rise of the conservative movement generally.
Okay. Well, let's get to some specifics. In May 2001, President Bush, he nominated his first slate of candidates for the bench, and there were some very controversial.
But wait, I mean, even before you talk about what he did, let's think about how he did it.
Okay, yeah, and that's the process.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, major White House ceremony. All of the nominees gathered in front of him. This was president's time and visibility is very important, and this was a statement by the president and by his administration that we care about these issues. President Obama's people, and I wrote about this in my next book, in they called The Oath, they decided, should we do the same thing? Should we roll out our appellate court nominees all at once? And they said, no, we want to lower the temperature on these issues. Now, we'll see put that issue aside of whether that succeeded or not. But the Bush administration had precisely the opposite idea, that this is important to us, we're going to fight for our judges, and they're going to stand for something ideologically.
I mean, it is a very curious way to do this because, and they particularly get hung up on several controversial nominees. Estrada being the primary nominee that causes the most heartburn for them.
Right.
But overall, it's a fairly successful slate of nominees. How would you kind of characterize the process itself? For instance, the presidency and working with the Senate in the confirmation process. How had that changed? What did we see?
Well, traditionally, district court nominees are very much the province of home state senators, particularly if there is one or more Republican senators from that state. Circuit court nominees are very much more the province of the president. And the goal of the Bush administration was to get impeccably qualified nominees, well-regarded lawyers, excellent law schools, excellent, conventional credentials, whether it's working in the Solicitor General's office or the White House or top law firms having argued major cases, but with strong political views. They were determined. Now, everybody speaks to a certain extent in code about judicial politics. And, the code that President Bush always used was, I want judges who will interpret the law, not legislate from the bench. Well, who can disagree with that, right? I mean, but what that means is overturn Roe versus Wade. What it means is limit affirmative action. What it means is expand executive power. What it means is interpret the Second Amendment as guaranteeing an individual right to bear arms. I mean, there is a package of views that these nominees were meant to implement. Now, some of them, might not agree with all of them, but that's why these judges were nominated, for those specific policy goals.
Well, let's talk about Miguel Estrada.
Yeah. Miguel, by the way, was a law school classmate of mine and a friend and someone I admire a lot.
And he is impeccably credentialed.
He
was very well qualified. It seemed to be, as maybe they said in the administration, a slam dunk nominee, but he raises a lot of issues for the Democratic Party. Explain exactly why this.
Well, what happened was everyone knew from the start, given Miguel's obvious qualifications, that he was nominated to the D.C. Circuit very much with the eye as putting him being the first Hispanic on the Supreme Court, which would have been a very significant thing. And so there was also in these sort of, political circles that I talk about, that I mentioned earlier, the conversation among the people in Washington who follow these issues. Miguel is not a politician. He is not someone who had written, I think, any law review articles. I mean, so no one had a paper trail of what he actually believed about these issues, but it was commonly believed in the world in which these people circulate that Miguel was very conservative. So what the fight was really about was, is he going to be given the stepping stone to the Supreme Court? That's what the fight was about. The problem for Miguel is that the Democrats picked a fight about process, which was, we want to see the memos he wrote when he was in the Solicitor General's office. Now, if you think about it, Miguel was in the Solicitor General's office in the Clinton administration. So what was he going to do? Like tell Drew Days, the Solicitor General, his secret plan to overturn Roe v. Wade? I mean, there was a political position that the Clinton administration had. So the memos themselves were, I think we can likely infer, harmless, meaningless, not particularly, but it was an attempt to see what he thought personally about these issues. But where Miguel, I think, was really sort of betrayed by the Bush administration, the Bush administration decided to say, we're not going to show you these memos, that there is some sort of privilege associated with them, so you can't see them. So the Democrats managed to turn the fight from Miguel's qualifications, which is a fight they were definitely going to lose because Miguel was superbly qualified, to one about process and the Senate's right to inquire, which is a much better political fight for them. And the 60-vote threshold they managed to hold themselves together for a filibuster on this. They managed to stop his nomination.
So, along with Estrada, you have Priscilla Owen and Charles Pickering, and this group, which the Democrats eventually, they're going to filibuster these nominees, but it gave Senator Charles Schumer sort of the end to start to talk about deciding these issues on an ideological basis.
Right.
And so, sort of what you're saying here and what we've also heard is, the ideological had always been there, but now we're going to talk about it openly. Right.
And what's interesting, and this is that the party in power doesn't want to talk about ideology. They want to do ideology, but they don't want to talk about ideology. They want to talk about qualifications. They want to talk about legal excellence, fancy law schools, fancy clerkships. The party out of power wants to say, no, none of that stuff matters. What matters is they are going to do the following unpopular thing as judges. And that's what Schumer was doing. Now, it's my belief, just as a citizen and as someone who follows these issues, that we'd all be better off if we spent a lot more time talking about ideology than qualifications, regardless of the president. But, you saw it with, even the Obama administration is an exact same thing. It said, no, we're just talking about excellence, not about ideology. And that argument usually works for when people aren't paying a heck of a lot of attention to the issue.
Well, I guess one of the questions I would have are these handful of nominations, which President Bush renominated after they were filibustered after the midterm elections in 2002. They really want to have this fight, regardless of the fact that they had a pretty good record of getting their nominations confirmed. I think over a couple hundred in the first term. Why is it that they want to have this fight?
Who's they?
The administration.
They want to have this fight because they care about these issues. They want conservative judges on the bench.
But they were getting them with several of the other nominations.
They want more. They want their people. They want Janice Rogers Brown. They want Priscilla Owens. They want ultimately Brett Kavanaugh, because they want the unfortunately what I see is sort of the pervasive dishonesty about these debates is that no one really says what they are talking about. The reason Republicans want their judges on the bench is because they want to overturn Roe v. Wade. They want to end racial preferences. They want to expand executive power. They want to speed up the death penalty. The reason the Democrats want their judges on the bench is because they want to expand gay rights. They want to protect racial preferences. They want to enforce environmental regulations. These are substantive, important goals to both sides. But in public, what they both say when they're in power is, no, we're not doing this to pack the courts with people who agree with us. We're just doing it because we want excellent judges. It's not. It's not an honest way to conduct a debate, I think.
The effect of September 11th, national security, war, and the unitary executive. These are issues that are obviously very important to the administration after this, and they're not really talked openly in some of these nomination battles, but they're very important once they have people on the court. What would you?
I'm not sure. I mean, I would look at it a different way. After 9/11, President Bush was in a very powerful political position. One of the ways he exercised his power was by nominating and trying to confirm very conservative judges. I don't think in particular he was pushing judges because they were going to help him on national security. There actually is not that much difference between Democratic and Republican judges on those sorts of issues. Yes, on Guantanamo, there was a particular split on the court. But, in terms of the right to surveillance and that sort of thing, the executive pretty much gets what it wants.
So, I mean, early in the administration, there's no way that they could have, imagined some of the court decisions, Hamdan and some of these others.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't, I don't think, Guantanamo turns into kind of a discrete area unto himself, and there's the trilogy of cases there, all of which the Bush administration loses. But, I mean, it's worth keeping in perspective the magnitude or lack of magnitude of those losses. They didn't release these people. They just said, give them some more due process, which, was, I suppose, embarrassing and a disappointment, but it certainly didn't strike at the heart of the Bush war on terror. And, the techniques, electronic and otherwise, that were part of that war on terror were never really checked by the courts.
Well, moving ahead to the actual nominations for the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about the influence of outside groups, outside people, and I specifically think of this idea of the Four Horsemen. And
I mean, there are people in Washington who care about these issues passionately. And, Leonard Leo is the paradigm of that. And, it is no exaggeration to say that he had been waiting 10 years for a Republican nominee. And you cannot overstate the bitterness that the conservative movement felt about David Souter. That, they were not going to simply let a president of their party pick someone he liked because, he had a good feeling about him, that they wanted a sure thing. They wanted a sure thing conservative vote for decades. And they were going to insert themselves into the process to make sure that happened. And I don't say that in any sort of sinister way. They had every right to do that. And they were, to the extent I was aware, welcomed by the Bush administration. And their expertise was drawn on by members of the administration who had a lot of other tasks on their plate as well.
So, I mean, it wasn't unusual. Thinking of these Four Horsemen, Leonard Leo and Jay Sekulow, Boyden Gray and Meese. I mean, these are, in essence, private citizens brought so closely into this process. Had that happened before?
I think, the short answer is I don't think so. is that I don't think they had been brought into the process before, outsiders. But, I mean, administrations exist. They get elected because they have ingratiated themselves with political movements. And they act as president in most cases to do what their movement wants. Now, this was an unusually well-organized movement and unusually focused on a single thing, Supreme Court appointments. But I don't think there was anything particularly unusual about their involvement. I mean, I'm just reading now I just happen to be reading several books about the 64 to 66 period in the Johnson administration, where you have the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and Medicare and Medicaid and all that. And you see how closely the Johnson administration worked with the civil rights movement, and how some tasks were essentially outsourced to the activists, and some were done in house. That's it's just that's how presidents operate when they want to get things done.
I guess maybe one of the arguments that we hear is there's sort of an unprecedented matter of being able to veto specific people, and I'm thinking particularly of Alberto Gonzalez.
Well, yeah, the line you that circulated was Alberto Gonzalez is Spanish for David Souter. You heard that among people in the movement. Whether that's true or not, I don't think anyone knew. Gonzalez had one vote on one abortion case in Texas when he was on the Supreme Court, an extremely convoluted case where he voted on what was perceived as the pro-abortion side. And, these people threw a fit. What kind of justice Alberto Gonzalez would have been, it's fair, I doubt that one vote had much to say about it. But the imputation that there is something sinister about these four horsemen or anyone else saying, we like this nominee, we don't like that nominee. So what? That's their right. I just don't see why that should be perceived as something inappropriate. And by the way, George W. Bush was the president, not these folks. He wanted to nominate, he couldn't nominate anyone he wanted. And when we get to Harriet Miers, we'll see what that means. But anyway, I just don't think there was anything inappropriate about the activities of the Four Horsemen.
Well, you just mentioned it. This is a very organized and very competent process that nominates Roberts, and it's sort of the model nomination that you would want, I guess, to some degree.
Well, and also Roberts was the model nominee because on all those lists of traditional qualifications, fancy law school, fancy clerkships, Solicitor General's office, White House counsel, back in the Solicitor General's office, D.C. Circuit. I mean, what more could you have in terms of qualifications? Also, you had a person who was known in the community as very conservative, but who'd never written a word that he could be confronted with. And they were not, they didn't want to pick that, he was a perfect nominee.
Although there were some on the right who even called him the safe choice. I think even Ann Coulter attacked the choice, but it was generally a successful...
I make it a practice not to respond to anything Ann Coulter says because I don't care. But anyway.
But regardless of those few voices, it was successful. But then you get to the Harriet Miers nomination, which is...
All right. The key thing that everyone forgets about Harriet Miers is Hurricane Katrina. President Bush is in a very different political situation at the time of the Roberts nomination and the time of the Myers nomination. John Roberts has just been reelected, not a landslide, but a clear record, a clear reelection. He has Republican Senate, and there's just yet a few months later, a handful of months later, his administration is nearing a state of collapse. And it is right when Katrina is falling apart, Louisiana is falling apart, that he picks Harriet Myers. And he does so because he likes Harriet Myers. And he likes the fact that she was his lawyer. And Laura Bush, who was not usually a public voice in that administration, holds a press conference in Africa, I believe, where she's on a tour, and she says, I think the president should nominate a woman because, and the president listens to that. The president does care about diversity. I think that's a little not emphasized enough. When the people I talked to on the inside, yes, he wanted conservative nominees, but he wanted a diverse slate of conservative nominees, women, African Americans who were also conservative. And so he says to the four horsemen, in effect, trust me, I know Harriet Myers. I know what's in her heart. I know what kind of justice she'll be. I'm going to pick her. And what happens? They tell him to go to hell, in effect, over a period of weeks. I mean, the nomination lasts, 4 weeks, 8 weeks? I'm trying to remember how long it was.
It's about a month.
It's about a month. And the other thing people don't remember about Harriet Myers is that it wasn't Democrats who defeated her nomination. It was Republicans for just this reason. Now, they came up with these various fig leaf reasons about, we can't get to these documents because there's these presidential privilege issues. Nonsense. The reason was they were worried she was going to turn into another David Souter. Some unknown with no particular paper trail. And she really had no paper trail. And this nomination was, it was really a preposterous nomination when you think about it. And unfair to Harriet Myers, who was a very distinguished lawyer at a fine firm in Dallas. But she wasn't a litigator. She didn't try cases particularly. She was she did administrative work. She ran the firm. She did work for the state of Texas, worked on the lottery. But there was no sign of any particular expertise in constitutional law in her background. And when she started meeting with the senators, that became apparent. She just didn't know. Now, why would she know? It'd be like asking, a physicist to, teach biology. Doesn't mean the physicist is stupid, but it's just not something she knew. And they sabotaged her nomination, the Republicans, because they cared so much about these issues. And they then went with a guy who was, in the words of one of the people I talked to high up in the Bush administration, 100%er. Or as this person said, Sam Alito never got a case wrong in 15 years. Wrong. By wrong, they mean, liberal. That's Samuel Alito then, that's Samuel Alito now.
Well, I want to kind of take a sideways track here, because this is really the last time. It's a small debate, but it is very present during the Myers nomination in what the court actually looks like. We talk about diversity in one way, but now we have almost all of the nominees from 2 or 3 law schools. They have the same type of experience. And so there's this question about, does she have to be a litigator? Does she have to have, the type of experience that the others have? And I think
the answer is, let's put it this. Let me put it this way. I think it's unfortunate that the court is now so narrowly focused, in background and in career path. When Alito replaced O'Connor, all 9 justices were former federal appeals court judges. When Brown v. Board of Education was decided in 1954, not one of the justices had ever been a full-time judge before. Think about how different that is. And I think there's a tremendous loss when you have people from such a narrow background. But this didn't happen by accident. It's really a response to the politicization of the process, because presidents have figured out that in the post-Bork era, the way you get nominees through is you say, oh, no, it's not because they are ideological, it's because they're so qualified, they're so excellent, they have so many fancy degrees, and the insiders all know what they think ideologically, but they get to pretend that the choice is about excellence, not ideology. That has really limited the pool of candidates, if that's how you approach the process. Now, I do think that if John McCain had won, he really would have put Lindsey Graham on the Supreme Court. And I really do hope, and Bill Clinton tried to get Mario Cuomo on, and he tried, with Richard Riley, the former Secretary of Education. I mean, he had an idea, but the process is now structured in a way that it's very hard for someone who is not in that traditional pipeline to get confirmed. Now, Harriet Meyer's other problem was that she didn't have the stature of a governor, a senator. She was utterly unknown except as George Bush's lawyer. And even in the pre-Bork days, the people who were not former judges, they were governor of California, like Earl Warren. They were head of the SEC, like William Douglas. They were an extremely prominent law professor, like Felix Frankfurter, attorney general, senator, like Hugo Black. Lots of former senators used to be on the Supreme Court. She didn't have that kind of stature. She was just like a, obscure lawyer, well-regarded from a large but not world-renowned law firm in Texas. I mean, it's not quite fair to say that she lost because she wasn't part of the club of fancy law schools. There were a whole series of problems with her nomination, and that was only one of them.
Well, in general, in these 4 weeks, we talked about some of the issues about what it told us about, the process. Is this the first time that maybe the public gets to see sort of how?
Yeah, I guess, they did sort of see it play out in real time because they saw Republicans sabotage her. And that, to the extent the public followed or knew, I don't know, the public doesn't follow these issues very closely anyway, but this was an unusually public playing out of the process.
Well, this is another question I particularly want to ask you, which is, how would you characterize the way the media covers this issue? We know that the public cares very little, but why do we not see more interest from the media?
Because nominations are abstractions. They are abstractions about abstractions. They are discussions of hypothetical cases where the justice has a hypothetical view about it. And so all we get from the news media basically is biography. And that's why, when these White Houses, and both sides do it, do their selling job, they create a biographical portrait that is easy to observe. Is easy. That task is easy in the case of someone like Sonia Sotomayor, given her background, given her triumph over adversity, given her trailblazer nature, not hard. It's a little harder with Samuel Alito or Elena Kagan. I mean, what was what was historic about their nominations? And I guess the story with Alito was just was excellence and long experience and 15 years on the appellate court bench. Elena Kagan, Solicitor General, first woman, Dean of Harvard Law School, excellence as well. But the way these nominations are sold are biographical details, because the news media, perhaps understandably, has a hard time articulating what the issues will be when the justices are confirmed.
Well, I mean, but what about in say the life of a justice and their decisions? And I'm thinking of June 2012. I mean, everyone is watching television to see what the decision over Obamacare will be. And you've had several of these types of moments where Roberts and Alito are very important to whether there's going to be a majority. And you often don't see any kind of connection between why they were nominated, the issues there.
You do if you're watching CNN, because I'll tell you. I mean, I don't. I mean, again, I don't mean to be unduly cynical about the news media process, but first of all, you've got to get people to care about any Supreme Court decision at all. Then you've got to explain what's at stake in that decision. In the case of National Federation of Independent Business, which you refer to, the issue is the scope of the Commerce Clause. And you can hear stations click, people using their clicker just, by using that word. Then you have to explain who appointed all 9 justices to, I mean, it's hard, it's abstract. It's not like, the Boston Marathon bombing. It's not like even passing Obamacare in the first place. It is about, it is abstraction layered upon abstraction. And, look, there is a core of people. They read the New Yorker. They read the National Review. They read, the op-ed pages of major newspapers, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. They care about these issues, but it's just not a big number of people.
Well, kind of looking toward concluding, let's talk about the legacy of Bush and his nominees and the judiciary in general. How would you characterize?
Well, I think it was. I think the George W. Bush legacy on the courts was a tremendous success on its own terms. That he set out to remake the courts in the ideological direction that his presidency represented, and to a great extent he did. And it was not the old-fashioned idea of judicial restraint, of deferring to the elected branches of government, which is what judicial conservatism meant in the 60s and 70s in the era of the Warren Court. It was a very active conservative vision, often striking down the actions of the elected branches of government. Gun control passed by city council, struck down. McCain-Feingold campaign finance, struck down. We'll see if Obamacare survives in the courts, passed by the democratically elected branches of government. I mean, these are very conservative judges who have a very clear political agenda. And the vast majority of them were confirmed. The vast majority of them have turned out to be precisely as advertised. And in the vast majority of cases, they vote the conservative line. That, to me, is success for a president and an administration that cared about these issues.
Well, I mean, you've covered the court extensively. I mean, particularly Justice Roberts. I mean, what would you say about how he has been on the court?
Well, look, I think, oh, I forgot, in striking down the Voting Rights, striking down the Voting Rights Act, perhaps the most celebrated achievement of the Great Society. Sections 4 and 5 are now gone, thanks to an opinion by Chief Justice Roberts. Look, I think Chief Justice Roberts is a very conservative judge. He is also well aware of the politics of the Supreme Court. And he is aware of trying to keep the Supreme Court out of the direct line of fire in the day-to-day politics of Washington, while still advancing the beliefs that he holds. I mean, you haven't exactly asked the question, but you said, well, then why did he vote to uphold Obamacare? Frankly, it still beats the hell out of me, but I can offer you some reasons. One, he was persuaded on the merits that it was a tax. I don't know, I find that sort of hard to believe, but anyway, that's about. The other thing, it was an election year, June of 2012. Had he ruled the other way, the Supreme Court would have been a major focus of the presidential campaign, because you would have had Citizens United, Bush v. Gore, and Obamacare, 5-4 decisions where the conservatives had really outraged a lot of even people in the middle. And he didn't want the court to be that sort of focus. So by voting the way he did, he took the Supreme Court out of the 2012 election. And also, I mean, frankly, I think the arguments that Obamacare was unconstitutional are really bad arguments. And it is worth noting that the idea of an individual mandate to buy insurance had been around for decades. And some people said it was a good idea, some people said it was a bad idea. No one suggested it was unconstitutional until a few months earlier. And it sort of went around the conservative echo chamber, and people convinced each other that it was true. But I think Roberts had enough institutional belief in the court to say, we don't want to be quite this political.
We talked about some big issues, and before we end, I guess, because you talked a lot about the community who work on these nominations and who help make them, and I know you talked about Kavanaugh, but others like Manuel Miranda and others.
Oh, Manny, yeah.
So
what's become of him?
Well, I mean, maybe kind of give us a sense of what these players are like, and what exactly that process.
Well,
is.
I mean, look, one thing I'll just tell you my Brett Kavanaugh story. It was just it's a bizarre thing. I was doing a piece about the Bush administration's judicial nominees, and he was very involved in this. And he agreed to talk to me on background. And the way White House officials sometimes do this is they don't like you to go to their offices and then what you'll hear or what you'll see. So he came down to the press room in the West Wing of the White House. And we're sitting there on a table, and like a lot of press rooms, there are TVs all around. And so Brett and I are having our interview, we're chatting, and on the TVs are President Bush landing on the aircraft carrier with the big mission accomplished sign, behind him. And I remember Brett and I were talking about, wow, that's some scene. Wow, that's like pretty amazing. And little did we know that it would have a somewhat different resonance in later years. But it's sort of like one of those, you remember where you were at precisely that moment. It was an unusual place for me to be. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. What are they like? They're really smart, by and large. They follow the Supreme Court very closely. They understand the ideological differences between the justices with great precision. They understand issues like originalism, living constitution, textualism. I mean, they are. It's a little like Moneyball for the Constitution. They know the players, they know the stats, they know who votes with whom, they know which cases are coming in the pipeline, they know which cert petitions are pending, they know what it means to vote defensively for cert. It's a universe of people who are extremely knowledgeable about the Constitution and the court. And what they understand far better than what the general public understands is that the questions before the court don't have right answers. Does the Constitution protect a woman's right to choose an abortion? May a university consider race in admissions? The Constitution, you have to have a legal ideology to answer those questions. The answer to those questions is not, well, obviously yes or no under the Constitution. The answer is, it depends who's on the court. And so these people care deeply about who's on the court because they know that more than the quality of the arguments is going to determine how these issues come out.
But I bring up Miranda for an obvious reason, which is the issue of giving the emails, the access to the Democratic emails.
Now you're stretching my memory. He got in trouble for something, right? What was it?
He gained access to
the emails of the Democratic staffers
of the Judiciary Committee.
Right.
He shared them in 2002. It sort of fits in with these other stories about Democratic strategies found on a disc on a street corner in D.C.
Yeah.
But it seemed to be the story that kind of tells you about the real intense political.
My experience with these people. I mean, I frankly have had a hard time remembering much of anything about Manuel Miranda, but he was sort of eccentric. I think these people play fair, by and large. They just want their side to win. The four horsemen. They're not like plotting to get embarrassing emails. They're just like saying, we want our guy on the Supreme Court, and we want our people to rally behind him. We have a majority in the Senate. Let's get this done. I mean, I don't see anything improper or untoward about that. That's just, it's politics.
They want him on the court for a reason. And there is a difference between what, say, Jay Sekulow may want and what, someone else, the Koch brothers may want. I mean, there's a difference here, but they want the same.
Yeah, you can overstate the divisions in these movements. Yeah, sure. What the Koch brothers want most of all is, the courts to limit regulatory powers narrowly, especially when it comes to the environment. And what Jay wants is a lower barrier between church and state. But these ideas tend to come as a package. So they're going to fight for the same nominees and against the same nominees. I mean, so I don't, people talk about the divisions in these movements, and I think they're usually overstated.
Well, I mean, if you're on the religious right and you begin fighting for nominees in the 80s, and your goal is to have Roe versus Wade overturned, I mean, that obviously never happened. So
It never happened, and stay tuned. Ted Cruz gets elected president. It's going to happen. I mean, one of the things about the Supreme Court, it takes a long time to get, and Ronald Reagan was not as conservative as the contemporary Republican Party. So the fact that he nominated Sandra Day O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy, who wound up voting to support Roe v. Wade, and William Rehnquist and Antonin Scalia, who voted to overturn it, that's about where Ronald Reagan was. He was sort of on the fence about that sort of issue. The contemporary Republican Party is not on the fence about it. And, if George W. Bush had more nominees to the court, we'd know. And we may yet know. Anthony Kennedy, who the hell knows what he's going to do? Chances are he wouldn't go all the way and overturn Roe v. Wade after being one of the authors of Casey, but, Casey was a long time ago.
Well, before we wrap up, what's the future? What is...
What the future? It's very easy to tell you what the future is.
What's the nomination process going to be like?
No. There's only one question that matters about the Supreme Court. It has nothing to do with the nomination process. It has nothing to do... Is that who's the president? That's the only question that matters. If the next president is Hillary Clinton, we're going to have one kind of Supreme Court. If the next president is Ted Cruz, we're going to have a different kind of Supreme Court. Everything else is just conversation. Everything else is just details. The only thing that matters is who's the president. And yes, it'll be difficult to confirm nominees, but someone's going to get confirmed eventually if Clinton or Cruz is the president, and they're going to be very, very different. And that's all that matters when it comes to the Supreme Court.
Maybe we can ask Ronnie White.
Wow, that's a little esoteric.
Yeah.
Yes, you mean the judge in Missouri?
Yeah, who Obama has...
He finally got him
finally
on.
under the court.
Right, yeah.
And, he was...
The stakes are a lot bigger than a single district court judge in Missouri. Yeah, he was the guy that Ashcroft dinged. Yeah. He's now confirmed, right?
Yeah, Obama renominated
But he's pretty
him.
old now, isn't he?
I think so.
Because I think he retired from the Missouri Supreme Court.
I mean, Clinton first made the nomination in 97.
97,
And
yeah.
then it came up again in 99.
Did you want to ask something?
No.
Did you have a question?
No, well, I did want to just, because it's getting a bit esoteric there, but it's pretty interesting. I wanted to just ask one sort of general question, if we could. It's something you've been talking about a little bit on CNN on the torture report from the Senate, and if you think that's going to, what the legacy of that is going to be for the history of the Bush administration. It made a big splash. Now not in the news as much, of course.
Well, I think torture is a big part of the Bush administration's legacy, period. And, we didn't need the Senate report to tell us that. You have a major part, there's, waterboarding is going to be a big part of George W. Bush's legacy. No question about that. Now, what you have, even within the Bush administration, is a split between the people who say, well, waterboarding really wasn't torture, and the Dick Cheney view, which is, you can call it whatever you want, but we're in a war for survival, and we did what we needed to do, and I'm proud we did it, and it worked. That extreme view of Cheney's is not one that I think is 100% shared even at the very high levels of the Bush administration. I've never heard, for example, President Bush, George W. Bush, talk that way about waterboarding and torture. So I think the Senate report is interesting and additional evidence, but it doesn't really change the fundamental fact that that torture in the wake of 9/11 is something that people are going to talk about this administration for as long as they talk about that administration. Now, as with most things, there'll be a debate about, was it moral? Was it effective? That's the kind of debate we're having now, but it's not going to go away. There are a lot of fights that presidents engage in over the course of 4 or 8 years that sort of peter out as insignificance or importance. This one won't. It's a big deal.
Well, I mean, thinking of ahead, if there's a Republican president, some of the people on the court, Kavanaugh being one, who are tangentially related to some of those debates. I mean, this is going to be an issue.
Absolutely. Kavanaugh, Paul Clement, who I would say those two are the most likely Republican nominees to the Supreme Court at those points. I don't know if either of them will have any particular responsibility for torture. I mean, Clement defended his client in the Supreme Court as in the Solicitor General's office. Kavanaugh was in the White House, but I'm certainly not aware of what his precise role was.
Well, I mean, the indication that I have, I mean, we talked to Viet Dan, who had, one of the architects of the Patriot Act. But
Yeah.
when he left the administration, he did criticize the detainee policy. And I do get a sense there was some debate. We don't know with who, we don't know what that meant inside the administration, but I can see this becoming a real issue.
Yes, but the detainee policy is not the torture policy. And if you believed that military commissions as opposed to federal district court trials was the appropriate way to resolve that, I don't think that's a disqualifying fact. I mean, I think that's a fairly esoteric debate. If you supported waterboarding, that's a very different thing. John Yo's not getting appointed to nothing. So yeah.
But you don't believe that these debates intersected at all within the administration, or that there would be?
Well, you're talking about a couple different things. I mean, I don't think judicial appointments was directly related to the torture, the issues about waterboarding and whatnot. I do think that the sort of more conservative elements of the administration wanted more conservative nominees, and they wanted more of a free hand to interrogate people any way they wanted. But I don't really see a direct connection between the two issues. Maybe I'm missing something, but I don't.
Well, I mean, and this is really murky because we don't kind of understand the dynamics, inside. But the sense that some of the most powerful lawyers are thinking about these issues and talking about these issues, about what exactly we can do, as far as a nation. And I guess you could see that becoming an issue if any of them.
You could. Oh, absolutely. Well, and you have, frankly, what I regard as a fairly scandalous position of that guy on the Ninth Circuit who wrote the memos with John Yoo, who I'm blanking on his name, who sails through, and John Yoo, whatever else you think about him, has. He's paid a pretty heavy price in terms, at least, of personal abuse for having written those memos. And his boss is rewarded with a lifetime appointment on the Ninth Circuit, which is, it's kind of amazing.
But, with the Republican president and eventually, the 55 million emails at the Bush Library will become an issue in these.
Yes, it will, but... those emails were not. Those memos were not out when this guy, whose name I keep forgetting, was nominated, And I think it's safe to say there is no way he would have been confirmed if that memo had been out. Zero chance.
So this is not the end of the story.
No, it's not. No, it's not.
So,
All right.
all right.
Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.